My mother was still unconscious when my stepfather started making phone calls. That detail didn't hit me right away. I was standing in the corridor of St. Michael's Hospital, still wearing the same jeans I'd thrown on at 4 a.m. when Carla called me, my coffee untouched and cold in my hand. My mother, Linda Chen, 61 years old, had just come out of what was supposed to be a routine gallbladder removal. Routine. That's the word they used. Routine. So, why did I feel like the walls were closing in? The surgery had gone fine. That's what the nurse told me. No complications, resting comfortably, would be awake in a few hours. I should have exhaled. I should have sat down, closed my eyes, and let the tension leave my body. Instead, my phone rang. A lawyer I had never spoken to in my life introduced himself in a calm, practiced voice and told me that my stepfather, Raymond Holt, had filed an emergency motion that morning, while my mother was still under anesthesia, to seize full control of her business shares. $3 million worth of the company she had spent 30 years building from nothing. Before we continue with this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. I didn't speak for several seconds. I just stood there in that corridor, fluorescent lights humming above me, and tried to understand what I was hearing. My mother's name is Linda Chen. She built Chinwei Logistics, starting with one rented desk, one laptop, and a client list of 4 small businesses who believed in her before she believed in herself. By the time I was a teenager, she had a staff of 20. By the time I moved out, she had contracts with regional distributors across 3 states. That company isn't just her livelihood. It is her. It is every 5 a.m. start, every missed school play, every holiday she worked through so that one day she wouldn't have to. And Raymond had moved to take it, not after her death, not after a dispute, but while she was sedated and couldn't say a single word in her own defense. I thought about the manila folder I'd seen on the kitchen counter the week before. Thick, rubber-banded. Raymond had slid it into his briefcase when he saw me looking. I thought about how calm he'd been before the surgery, how he'd kissed my mother on the forehead and told her everything was going to be fine. I walked back to her room. Raymond was already there, sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. He looked up when I entered and gave me a slow, easy smile. "I'm so glad you're here," he said. "We have some paperwork to go over." I didn't touch the folder. That was the first decision I made. Raymond slid it across the bedside table toward me like it was nothing, like we were sitting in a conference room and not beside my mother's hospital bed, where she lay pale and barely conscious, a monitor beeping steadily beside her head. I looked at the folder. I looked at him, and I left it exactly where it was. "I'd like to wait until my mother can speak for herself," I said. Raymond smiled like I'd said something naive. "Of course," he replied. "Whenever you're ready." That smile. I'd never trusted it. Not from the beginning, 6 years ago, when my mother introduced him at a Sunday dinner and looked at him the way she'd never looked at anyone since my father left. Raymond Holt was polished in the way that certain men are polished, the kind where you can't find a single thing to criticize, but something underneath never quite adds up. He wore good shoes. He remembered details. He made my mother laugh in a way that made her look 10 years younger. I wanted to like him. I really did. But there were things. Small things, at first. The way he'd started sitting in on my mother's board calls by year 3 of their marriage. Just listening, he said, just learning. The way he'd asked careful questions about the shareholder structure, about what happened to the company in the event of illness or death. My mother had called it attentiveness. I had called it something else privately, and kept it to myself because she was happy, and I didn't want to be the reason she wasn't. I stepped into the hallway and called Carla. Carla Mensa had been my mother's office manager for 11 years. She knew the company the way a person knows their own handwriting. When she picked up and heard my voice, she went quiet in that specific way that means someone already knows something is wrong. I told her about the motion, about Raymond's folder, about the amendment he was claiming my mother had signed, a document that would give him co-ownership of her shares if she became incapacitated. Carla was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Maya, there was a meeting in January. I've been trying to decide whether to tell you." Before she could say another word, my phone buzzed against my ear. An email notification. The sender was a law firm I didn't recognize. The subject line read, urgent, regarding Linda Chen's estate. The email had been sent 4 days ago. Before the surgery. Before the complication that made it necessary. Before any of this had officially begun. Someone had known this was coming, and they had been waiting for me to find out. I opened the email right there in the hallway, my back against the wall, one eye on my mother's room door. The sender was a man named Daniel Osei, an estate attorney based in the city. His message was short and precise in the way that serious people write when they don't want to be misunderstood. He said he represented Victor Shin, my mother's original business partner, the man who had quietly disappeared from Chinwei Logistics 2 years ago under circumstances my mother had described as mutual and never elaborated on. Daniel said Victor had been trying to reach me for 3 weeks. And then the last line of the email, "Do not let anyone execute documents on your mother's behalf until we speak." I called the number at the bottom of the email. Daniel picked up on the second ring. He spoke carefully, like someone who had been preparing for this conversation. He told me that Raymond had approached Victor 2 years ago with a buyout offer for his minority shares. Victor had declined. Within months, Raymond had orchestrated a series of internal disputes, miscommunications, manufactured friction with board members, a formal complaint that Victor had never seen coming. Victor had resigned rather than fight because he was 67 years old and tired, and because my mother, who Raymond had already spent 3 years carefully influencing, hadn't pushed back. But before Victor left, he made copies of everything. The founding documents, the original incorporation filing, every shareholder agreement going back to the beginning. And when he reviewed Raymond's amendment against those original documents, he found it. A signature that didn't match. Not slightly, meaningfully. The curves of the letters, the pressure points, the way my mother always looped the L in Linda, and never once didn't. Raymond's document had been signed by someone attempting to copy her handwriting. Someone who had clearly practiced, but not enough. I walked to the waiting room. Raymond was there, jacket still perfect, scrolling his phone with the patience of a man who believed he had already won. I told him I'd spoken to an attorney. I told him the amendment was going to be challenged. I kept my voice flat, and even because I didn't want him to see my hands shaking. He didn't flinch. He looked at me with something close to pity and said, "You've always been the outsider in this family, Maya. Your mother knew that." I left the waiting room without responding. But something he said had caught inside me like a splinter, not the cruelty of it, but the specific word he chose. Outsider. Daniel called back 20 minutes later. He said he'd been cross-referencing Raymond's amendment with the original incorporation filing, the founding document my mother and Victor had drawn up 30 years ago when the company was just an idea and a handshake. There was a clause, a protection clause, built in by Linda and Victor in the early days, designed to override any future shareholder amendment under one specific condition. A failsafe. The kind of thing two people add when they're young and cautious and have seen what happens when families fight over businesses. Daniel paused. And then he asked me something that made no sense. "Maya, is your mother's maiden name Chin? Or was it originally something else?" I almost dismissed the question. My mother was Linda Chin. She had always been Linda Chin. That was the name on her office door, on her business cards, on the framed incorporation certificate that had hung on her wall for 30 years. I had never thought to question it the way you never think to question the furniture in a room you grew up in. But then the memory surfaced. Quiet and specific, the way old memories do. I was maybe 14, maybe 15. I'd been looking for a birthday card to reuse, the kind of thing teenagers do, and I'd gone through the drawer in my mother's bedside table. Underneath a stack of old receipts and a broken watch, there was a card. Handwritten, the ink slightly faded. It was addressed to someone named Linda Kwan. I'd assumed it was a mistake. A different Linda. I'd put it back and never thought about it again. Until now. I told Daniel what I remembered. He exhaled slowly, like a man watching a puzzle piece slide into place. He explained it carefully. My mother had been married once before, briefly, in her mid-20s, before she built the company, before she built the version of herself that everyone knew. After the marriage ended, she had legally changed her name. Not back to her family name. Forward, to something new. Chun had been her grandmother's surname, a name she chose deliberately, a name that belonged entirely to her. The founding documents, the original ones Victor had preserved, listed the company's protected beneficiary under that birth name. Linda Kwan, not Linda Chun. Raymond's legal team had searched for vulnerabilities in the shareholder agreement using her current legal name. They had never found the original filing because they hadn't known to look for a different name. The protection clause didn't cover Linda Chun. It covered Linda Kwan. And it stated clearly that in the event of any dispute over shareholder control, the override right passed directly to her biological child. I stood completely still in that corridor for a long moment. I am her only biological child. Daniel had already filed an emergency injunction by the time we finished speaking. I walked back into my mother's room with steadier hands than I'd had all day. Raymond was standing by the window. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. And for the first time since I'd arrived at that hospital, the composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, and he excused himself without making eye contact. He didn't come back that evening. That night, I sat beside my mother's bed and watched her breathe. She was more alert now, drifting in and out, not ready for a conversation but present enough that I could feel her. At one point she opened her eyes and looked at me, and I didn't say anything about Raymond or the company, or any of it. I just held her hand. In the morning, she was fully awake. I sat forward and told her I needed to ask her something about her name. Her real name. The one before Chun. She looked at me for a long moment. Not surprised. Not afraid. Something else entirely. Something that looked, strangely, like relief. I was wondering when you'd finally find out, she said. Then she reached beneath her pillow and produced a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, that unmistakable looping L, the one no forged signature had ever quite captured. I had this written before the surgery, she said quietly. Just in case. My hands weren't steady when I opened that envelope. I'll be honest about that. I had held it together for nearly 2 days. Through the phone calls and the legal threats and Raymond's careful, practiced cruelty, but sitting in that hospital room with my mother watching me, her name written on the front in her own hand, I felt everything I'd been holding back start to rise. Inside was a letter. 2 pages, handwritten. And beneath it, a notarized document prepared by Daniel Osei. My mother had contacted Daniel herself, 6 weeks before the surgery. She had suspected Raymond's intentions for over a year. The careful questions about the shareholder structure, the way he'd begun positioning himself with board members she'd always trusted, the night she'd woken up late and found him at the kitchen table with documents she hadn't recognized. She hadn't confronted him. She knew Raymond well enough to understand that a cornered Raymond would be more dangerous than a confident one. So she had done something quieter, smarter. She had rebuilt her legal protections from the foundation up. Using her original birth identity, she had worked with Daniel to reinforce the founding clause Victor had helped her write 30 years ago. She had ensured that the protection ran through Linda Kwan, the name Raymond had never thought to investigate, and passed directly to me. Every door Raymond believed he was opening, my mother had already locked from the other side. His amendment was always going to fail. She had made certain of that before she ever went into surgery. She had protected everything. She had protected me. And then she had gone under anesthesia and trusted that if something went wrong, Daniel would reach me in time. I read the letter aloud. I don't entirely know why. It just felt wrong to read it silently, alone inside my own head. My mother listened with her eyes closed. She wrote that she had always known I was the one who would carry what she'd built. Not because I was the only option, but because I was the one who had always understood what it cost. She wrote about her first marriage, the years she'd spent becoming someone new, the grandmother whose surname she'd taken as an act of quiet reclamation. She wrote that she had never told me because she hadn't wanted her past to feel like a burden I had to carry. And then she wrote the line that broke me completely. You came from the strongest version of me. That's why you were always the one I trusted most. I set the letter down. My mother opened her eyes. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. Raymond was served with legal notice before he reached the airport. The emergency injunction held without challenge. His attorney withdrew from the case within 48 hours, a detail that told its own story. A forensic document examiner reviewed the amendment and confirmed what Daniel had suspected. The signature was inconsistent with every other known sample of my mother's handwriting on file. An investigation was formally opened. Raymond did not contest it publicly. He moved out of the family home within 2 weeks, quietly, in the way that men do when they understand the walls have already closed. Victor Shin received a call from Daniel informing him that Chinwei Logistics was protected and intact. He sent me a handwritten note that arrived 10 days later. It said, "Your mother built something worth protecting."
So, did she?
I kept it. I still have it. 3 months later, my mother was back at the office. Part-time for now, her doctor's orders, which she was following with more compliance than I'd expected. We sat across from each other at the long table in the boardroom, the same room where she'd signed her first major contract 22 years ago, a framed copy of which still hung near the door. I had formally accepted my role as secondary shareholder. I was learning the business slowly, seriously, in the way that things worth learning deserve. I still took design work occasionally, but less. My mornings now began with logistics reports and supplier calls and conversations I didn't always fully understand yet, but was starting to. My mother watched me struggle through a contract clause one afternoon and laughed. A real laugh, full and easy, the kind I hadn't heard from her in months. "You're going to be better at this than I was," she said. I looked up from the document. I looked at the office around us, the one she had built from a single desk and an idea and 30 years of refusing to quit. The one she had quietly, carefully, kept safe when no one was watching. I thought about the envelope under the pillow, the clause hidden in the founding documents, the name she had chosen for herself and passed, without ever saying so, to me. Some things are worth the fight. And some fights, your mother already won for you.